This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, 20, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the 1956 Suez War. For those of you who are new to the podcast, this is now our 17th episode on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you want to start back at the beginning, you can find a full overview of this series at our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. You can also find reading recommendations there about Israeli, Palestinian, and European history. And of course, we also have a number of episodes on European history, so you can find a broad overview of that there as well. Finally, before we get started today, just a brief programming note. We've been doing a lot, obviously, over the course of the past year on the history of Israel-Palestine. But after we cover the Six-Day War, which will be probably about 2 to 3 episodes from now, we're going to go back to having a stronger focus again on European history. And we're going to begin with a 12-part series on the history of Nazi Germany. Now, these episodes will cover all of the basic things that you need to know about, big questions such as how did Hitler come to power? How did he establish a totalitarian dictatorship? And how and why did the Holocaust take place? Now, in addition to these basic episodes, we're also going to record a number of special episodes on specific topics such as Nazism and the occult, detailed history of Auschwitz. And these special episodes will only be available to our Patreon supporters. So if you're enjoying the podcast, if you're interested in finding out more about this sort of special series, again, check out our website, www.historyoffthepage.com for updates. All right, but enough about that. For now, let's get back to Israel-Palestine and the 1956 Suez Crisis. Now, Suez is a really big moment, historically speaking, and there are a variety of reasons for this, one of which is that the story of Suez is basically an ending story. It marks the exit of one of the most important players in this drama that we have been unpacking for you, and of course that player is the British Empire. Now, the British, technically speaking, weren't really there that long. One could argue that the British presence obviously goes back to World War I. Maybe you want to predate it a couple decades earlier if you're talking about the British involvement in Egypt, as we will today. But the intensity, the critical nature of decisions made by the British in this unfolding relationship between Jews and Arabs in Palestine is a tremendously important one. If you think back to some of the most consequential points in again, this narrative, in this timeline, you're talking about 1917 and the Balfour Declaration, the moment when the British kind of give political legitimacy to the idea of Zionism. You're talking about the closing of Palestine to Jews in the 1930s, when the Nazis are trying to kick Jews out of Germany. There's nowhere else for them really to go, including the United States. And the British basically say, well, no, Palestine will be closed to you as well. You will not have an opportunity to go there for refuge. We're talking about right after World War II, when again, there are hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees. No one wants them. There's nowhere for them to go. And the British keep Israel closed because of these kind of tensions between the two ethnic groups. There are, of course, a lot of smaller but nonetheless very significant moments along the way, right? As the British are setting up the Mandate in Palestine in the 1920s, the way that they treat Jews, the way that they treat Arabs, the way they elevate the Mufti, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, to be the kind of main spokesman, politically speaking, for the Arab community there. So the British play an incredibly important role in the story. And even after 1948, they're not ready yet to kind of completely let go of their interest in the Middle East. Indeed, they feel like they're going to come back. World War II is over. It's time to rebuild. Yes, India has become independent, but the British still feel like they are an imperial power. They still have an empire in Africa at this point. But Suez in 1956 will kind of be the wake-up call that the dream of empire is over. The story of Suez, in many ways, is the story of the ending of the British Empire. It revealed that Britain could no longer control its own fate, let alone control the fate of dozens of other countries and other peoples. It's not a coincidence that in the immediate aftermath of the Suez Crisis, the British Empire in Africa essentially falls apart, and by 1960-61, most of those states will be independent. There's some others that'll come a little bit later on in the 60s, but for the most part, again, 1956 is the bell tolling to announce the death of the British Empire. You could also argue, if you want to put it this way, that it's the moment of transition from the imperial world of the 19th, early 20th century to the new world, which will be dominated by superpowers. Now, of course, Suez is not only a British story. It is also, in a sort of surprising way, a French story as well. And while the consequences of French failure were not quite as obvious to people as they were to those in the UK, the big moment in terms of the French Empire falling apart, some of it has already happened at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, when the French are forced to kind of give up on their colonies in French Indochina. The big moment for France, of course, is losing the Algerian War, and that will come to a conclusion in 1962. But in many ways, again, this moment of Suez, it is the chime at midnight. It is the moment when it becomes very obvious that the idea of a continued French empire is no longer going to exist, or at least it will have to radically change its format from an empire where France is kind of playing the decisive role, everybody else is kind of following along, towards something else, something like a commonwealth, something like a kind of cultural union. When you get into the 1960s, setting aside Algeria, most of the French colonies in Africa are given an opportunity to do and vote for independence. Two that didn't are Morocco and Tunisia, and that's because they had already achieved independence in 1956, but before the moment of Suez happens. So again, I know our focus here is on Israeli and Palestinian history, but one could argue that Suez is a quintessentially important moment in the history of Europe as well. It again is this moment of transition from external empire to the Cold War and to what's coming next. By the way, speaking of what's coming next, it's not coincidental that the origins of the EU also come from the 1950s, when Europe is in this moment of transition. We'll talk later in a different episode about the European coal and steel community, but really the foundational moment of the modern EU is the 1957 Rome Treaty, right? So coming literally just on the heels in some ways of Suez, although the connections are not quite as like A to B direct there. So again, Suez marks an ending point in many ways for a narrative line of history that we've been exploring. But Suez will also be an origin story. Suez will mark the rise of Arab nationalism and its prophet Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, of course, both existed beforehand. Nasser initially kind of seizes power in a 1952 coup, along with some other people that we'll talk about in a little bit. 1954, Nasser has kind of gotten rid of those other rivals, has achieved kind of supremacy within Egypt in terms of politically becoming dictator. But Nasser is not yet the legend. Nasser is not yet the world historical figure of destiny. It is Suez that will make him into that. Similarly, when we're talking about Arab nationalism, you can date Arab nationalism back to at least the middle of the 19th century. You could probably push it back even to the beginning of the 19th century, depending on kind of how you want to interpret the idea of nationalism. But before 1956, Arab nationalism is one of a number of sort of paths or strands, if you will, in the Arab world that people see as a means to move forward and to kind of break free of colonial domination, to kind of achieve independence. You have, of course, people that say, look, the path forward is to be more like Europe. We want kind of European liberalism. We want to follow the European model and do essentially what the Europeans have achieved. You have people like the Muslim Brotherhood that say the answer is actually we have too much secularism. The answer is to go our own path and go back to after World War I roots, which are Islamic, kind of exciting ideas. So we need to do more people living in the colonial world is communism, religious belief, and religious identity. You also have, as we'll see, a native kind of Egyptian fascist movement that grows up. So we have all kinds of intellectual currents going on, all kinds of sort of political and social trends. What is going to be the path forward? 1956 convinces many Egyptians, convinces many people around the Arab world that Arab nationalism is the way to go. Secularism, modernization, unity. These are kind of the key pillars that not only Nasser, but other Arab leaders will kind of push towards in the wake of the successes of 1956. And so again, the story of 1956 is not just triumph over the Israelis, the British, the French, but it is a moment in which Arabs seem to take control of their destiny. And this sentiment will then send shockwaves throughout the political structures of the Middle East, including Israel and its Arab neighbors. And so because the story of Egypt and Nasser are so important to the larger picture here, we're going to spend a little time at the beginning of today's podcast doing a kind of deeper dive into Egyptian history. We're going to talk about how the British wound up in Egypt in the first place, because it doesn't quite fit the sort of stereotypical idea of the British are greedy, the scramble for Africa, they're just trying to take everything they can get. The details are a little bit more complicated than that, even though there is kind of that element in the larger picture. We're going to talk about why the Egyptians were first sort of accepting of this and then why the Egyptians wanted them to leave. And again, this is such a critical part of the Israeli-Palestinian story because in many ways, Nasser's Arab nationalism can best be understood as anti-colonialism. And for many Arabs, as we've seen over the course of the podcast, the opposition to Israel isn't necessarily directly related to questions about Judaism. Jews had lived in the Middle East for centuries alongside Arabs before this, but it has to deal with the idea of anti-colonialism. For many Arabs, the foundation of the State of Israel is understood as the last colonial moment, the last act, if you will, of European colonialism, of domination. And so if you want to be anti-imperialist, which is really what Nasser's Arab nationalism was all about, as we'll see, then ejecting Israel, defeating Israel, that becomes the ultimate test of your anti-colonial bona fides. To put my point a little bit more directly, what I'm trying to say here is that you can argue that for Arabs, the politics of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s had to be, by definition, anti-Israeli, because they had to also be anti-colonial. That popular enthusiasm for Nasserism forced Arab statesmen in countries like Jordan to be anti-Israeli. It precluded the possibility of peace because peace would have been viewed as accepting colonialism. And so again, this is why we're going to spend so much time in the beginning of the podcast talking more about Egyptian history than we will Israeli or Palestinian history, although of course I'll bring them all together at the end. One final thought before we get into the history itself. Although Israel obviously plays a pretty critical role in the story of 1956, Israel, of course, will invade Egypt, will invade the Sinai, right? So they are fairly important in that regard. The question of what Suez meant for Israel is actually much smaller than it was for Britain, France, or Egypt. And we can actually say pretty much the same thing about the Palestinians. When all the dust had settled, and the IDF had withdrawn from the Sinai Peninsula in 1957, the geopolitical context of the Middle East is basically the same. Israel had the same borders that it had in 1948. It faced the same sort of existential threats, right? A very small country, neighbors around you that won't agree to your right to exist, that don't recognize your legitimacy as a government. So we'll see there were some UN forces along the border with Egypt that made Israelis feel slightly better. But on the whole, for many Israelis, they still live in this kind of existential moment. 1948 may have marked the foundation of an Israeli state, but it did not mark the end of anxieties about its existence. 1948, in some ways, is a date written in pencil, not in pen. It is something that can be changed or reversed at any moment. Again, the situation is basically the same for Palestinians. After 1956, Palestinians still mostly lived in refugee camps, especially in Gaza. They still dealt with incredible poverty, statelessness. So again, to basically put it bluntly, for Israelis and Palestinians, 1957 looks an awful lot like 1955. The one thing that it does, however, is that it kind of creates this world in which the pressures for another war are still largely there. In some ways, it freezes the conflict in time in such a way that once events begin moving in 1967, all of the kind of safeguards come out and war returns, and you'll get almost a replay in many ways of the 1956 Suez War, but this time it'll be in 1967. There are going to be some key differences. We'll get into that, obviously, when we talk about the Six-Day War. So again, in today's episode, we're basically going to flush out the background positions and causes that led to the Suez Crisis. We'll discuss the Israeli and Palestinian roles in fomenting the conflict, including what led Israel to attack. And then in the next episode, we'll discuss the course of the war itself. Okay, let's get into some actual history here. We're going to start by talking about how the Suez Canal got built in the first place, and as I said, how the British became so deeply involved in Egyptian society. Because it's not the kind of stereotypical story of Britain wants to take over, Britain loves colonies, scramble for Africa. As I said, the story here is actually a little bit more complicated. In fact, if you go back to the beginning of discussions about really building a Suez Canal, the British were actually very hostile to it. The British at that time had already set up their colony at the Cape of Good Hope. This was the main route to get from Europe to Asia. And so as they're thinking about this idea of a Suez Canal, they see it as being a rival. They see it as being something that could compete with British colonies and British dominance. Another issue for the British is that Egypt was, at that time, part of the Ottoman Empire. And the British had very good relations with the Ottomans. The British were allied with the Ottoman government. They wanted to back and support the Ottoman government. And so the question of being involved in Egypt, of turning Egypt into a British colony, that was in many ways seen, at least at the beginning of the 19th century, as counterproductive. Now, Egypt has an interesting kind of place in the Ottoman Empire. Basically, of course, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon goes down there. Napoleon takes over Egypt, starts doing some very interesting things in terms of trying to reorganize the government, trying to reorganize Egyptian society. Eventually, the British are able to kick the French out of Egypt. And in 1805, an Albanian soldier named Muhammad Ali had essentially become the governor of Egypt. So he's one of the guys leading the sort of charge, trying to kick the French out, and then eventually he will kind of rise to become the sort of main leader of Egypt, or the main governor of Egypt. Now, once he does this, it's very interesting. he starts trying to modernize Egypt, and he starts trying to pull power away from the Sultan, and he tries to kind of build up autonomy in this province of Egypt. Later on, he'll get involved in fighting in Greece. So he's a very interesting guy. A lot of interesting history there that we don't have time to get into. But again, basically the British, up until the 1870s, don't really want to be involved in the canal at all. Instead, it's going to be the French that are going to play the decisive role in bringing about the realization of the canal. And the key figure here was a French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps. Lesseps had basically been stationed in Alexandria in the 1830s. He read about the idea of building a canal. This was an idea actually that Napoleon Bonaparte had kicked around. There were some other people in the beginning of the 19th century, even late 18th century, thinking about what if we were able to build a canal here? But it always seems like kind of a pipe dream, right? It's always like people are talking about going to Mars. We never end up going to Mars. The idea is out there, but what if it could happen? After some ups and downs in the diplomatic service, Lesseps returns to Egypt in 1854, and he manages to get support from the Wali, or the governor, Said Pasha. Said Pasha was one of the younger sons of Muhammad Ali, and he had come to power that same year after the assassination of his brother Abbas, who had tried to limit foreign influence in Egyptian society. Now, Said Pasha and Abbas Pasha are very, very different people, right? Abbas is kind of the more localist, the idea who's we don't want foreign influence. Whereas Pasha had actually grown up with considerable exposure to European society. He actually was a friend of Lesseps from when they were both children. He used to go over to Lesseps' dad's house. Said Pasha had actually been educated in Paris. And so when he came to power, he kind of had these Europeanized ideas in his mind. He wanted to modernize Egyptian society. He wanted to make investments, build railroads, start growing cotton. And so he takes a number of actions towards this idea of modernization. Another thing he talked about was banning slavery. And so again, there's a kind of natural partnership that emerges between Said Pasha and Lesseps. Now, Lesseps is not just doing this for his own benefit. He's not just interested in, let's build canals, let's have connections. Lesseps also sees this as kind of a French national achievement. France in the early 1850s had become an empire once more. It was led by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon III, as he's often referred to. Louis Napoleon does not want to conquer Europe. He realizes that, it didn't work out well for my uncle. I don't want to repeat the same mistakes. People might be a little nervous about that. But nevertheless, if I have an empire, I need to win glory. I need to do incredible things. We need to build incredible things. And so how can France realize its sort of national glory under Napoleon III? The answer becomes, in some ways, building the Suez Canal. Incidentally, Lesseps' cousin happens to be Napoleon's wife, Eugenie. So there's also kind of like a direct kind of family interest here as well. But building the canal becomes a symbol for both the French and the Egyptians of modernization, of, again, technological supremacy, achievement. It's a big wow moment, right? And so they all want to invest in it. Of course, the problem is, as it often is, a question of money. Where are the Egyptians, who are, again, not independent, but are still part of the Ottoman Empire, where are they going to get all this money to build themselves a canal? And so basically what they do is, again, modern solutions to modern problems. They will create a trading company known as the Suez Canal Trading Company, and they will raise money by selling shares in that company. Just under half of these shares will end up going to Said Pasha and the Egyptian government. The rest kind of go on the market, and the French are very excited about this project. And so French investors will buy up a lot of the shares that are out there. Again, at this point, the British remain mainly aloof. They're not interested in it. They see it as, again, competition to the Cape of Good Hope. And so they kind of, again, allow all this to happen without really much intervention. On April 25th, 1859, work began at the northern terminus of the canal, including the construction of a new city, which will be named Port Said after the Wali of Egypt. Now, as you might expect, construction on the canal is quite difficult. We are into the period of industrialization. The Industrial Revolution has happened, but we haven't quite mechanized things yet beyond just sort of basic railroads. We don't have backhoes and typical construction vehicles, right? We don't have the combustion engine. And so a lot of the Suez Canal is going to have to be dug by hand. Now, as you can imagine, to dig the Suez Canal out by hand is going to be a pretty incredible job to do. It is going to require a massive mobilization of resources and labor in order to make it happen. Over the course of about the 10 years of its construction, over 1.5 million people work on the canal at one point or another. Now, before 1864, a lot of this labor is actually unpaid. Slavery at this point had been banned, but they still had something called the corvée. The corvée was an idea of sort of labor that you owed to the state or that you owed to nobles in the European context. And so a lot of these workers working on this are not really formally compensated. Outside of labor, when you are talking about building something like a canal, you also need the raw materials in order to be able to build the canal. You also need the supplies, the food, the water, right? You're building a giant, ditch in the middle of the desert. You're going to need fresh water. All of these things have to be brought in because there isn't a whole lot of it in the canal area, right? In the Sinai Peninsula, there's not naturally a lot of water. There's not even naturally a lot of wood, at least the type of wood that you would use for construction. And so under these conditions, it's not surprising that there are a significant number of workers who die during the construction of the Suez Canal. It's not quite as bad as the Panama Canal. It's not a tropical zone. You don't have malaria and things like that to deal with. The official kind of death toll number is around 1,000. How credible this number is open to interpretation, right? If you're talking about the official sources, they want to kind of downplay the number of people that are dying in this process. Nasser will, later on during a famous speech announcing the nationalization of the canal in 1956, Nasser will claim 120,000 Egyptians died during this process. That's probably a little on the high side. More reasonable figures probably put the death toll in the 3,000 to 5,000 range, though it may have been a little bit higher than that, right? It's always hard to know. Detailed records aren't quite as detailed as they are today. But the basic point is, again, that the building of the Suez Canal comes at an enormous cost. It takes 10 years. It costs thousands of lives, 433 million francs, and the moving of 74 million meters of cubic earth. On August 18th, 1869, they finally finished construction of the Suez Canal, and in November of that year, it will be officially opened with a massive celebration featuring some of the most important royal families in Europe. Now again, as I've said, the British aren't really in Egypt yet. When all this is going on, the big notables that are at this celebration in November 1869 are the French. It's not the British. The British will only really start to become interested in the canal in the 1870s. And their entrance into Egyptian politics largely starts with this issue of debt, right? As I mentioned, to build a canal is expensive. To build railways is expensive. And so one of the things that the Egyptians do over the course of time is they borrow a lot of money, especially from European bankers. As the debt becomes increasingly difficult to pay off, Said decides to sell his shares in the Suez Canal Company. When this happens, the British Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Disraeli, realizes that the Suez Canal is actually going to become a vital link to India, which is the heart and soul of the British Empire. And so at this point, he moves in to purchase most of those shares from, again, Said Pasha. Britain will take on a 44% ownership of the company. The French will have most of the rest of it. Now, selling off your assets is something you can do, I guess. But if you don't change the underlying issue here of spending more money than you can generate, the debt issue will come back. And unfortunately, it did again for the Egyptians in the late 1870s. When this happens, British and French authorities will move into the Egyptian government and they will begin trying to secure ways to guarantee payment from Egyptian revenues towards those European debts. I don't want to get into a lot of the details here because we don't have time, but basically this creates resentment among the local population. In 1881, there was an uprising led by a colonel named Urabai. And this uprising is then forcefully put down by British troops. And so despite Egypt still kind of nominally being an Ottoman province, the British will essentially take over the day-to-day operations of government, and they will establish relatively formal colonial control over the territory. Incidentally, this is a kind of typical European colonial playbook, right? You have some kind of disturbance, riots, attacks on Europeans. That's followed up with European armies sort of advancing, trying to punish supposedly the people responsible. And then once they're there, the Europeans will begin to create a colony, begin to sort of take over the administrative control of that territory. Now, when the British initially arrive in Egypt in the 1880s, it creates this kind of interesting sort of love-hate relationship between the British and the native population. On the one hand, the hate portion of this relationship is pretty obvious for most of us to understand today. Rarely do people welcome being colonized. As the British set up a colonial government, they are not doing so really with the best intentions for Egyptians. They're not doing so because they care so deeply about Egyptian society and they want to modernize it and help out and just kind of do the right thing, even though they kind of have this idea of the white man's burden in the background. But in reality, they take over Egypt and they start running it for British benefit. One of the ways that we can see this is in terms of Egyptian agriculture and the Egyptian economy. The British will come in and they will say, here are these initial attempts to make cotton into a focus of the Egyptian economy in the 1860s, right? Basically, American Civil War happens. There's a blockade. The Confederates can't get their cotton out, and they're trying to sort of leverage it to get the British to participate in the American Civil War. The Egyptians use this as a moment to start planting cotton, start selling cotton, start making money. By the time you get to the 1880s, however, there are a number of places that are selling cotton, and the British decide to make this sort of the single most important, or by far the dominant, export of the Egyptian economy. And of course, if you're selling cotton in the 1860s and there's a shortage and you're able to produce that, that's great. You can make a bunch of money off of it. But if it becomes your sole crop and there's more and more competition now to sell that cotton, your economy is now at the mercy of global cotton prices. If there is a massive overproduction of cotton, the value of your cotton is going to fall and your society will suffer. You're not going to have the money to pay off some of those debts or to invest in new economic development. For the British, of course, that doesn't matter. If there's a global crash in the price of cotton, great. We can buy more of it up. We can get more of it cheaper. Sell our textiles cheaper, maybe. Make bigger profit margins. Another example of why Egyptians become frustrated with British colonialism is related to the bureaucracy. The British come in and say, we're not going to get rid of the Egyptian bureaucracy, but we want you guys to hire British advisors. And so even though nominally the British advisors are kind of underneath the Egyptian bureaucrats, when the British make a suggestion, it's kind of like being voluntold. And it's like, okay, we want you to do this. This would be a good idea. And then, okay, so we'll just do it. Now, as bad as that sounds, these British advisors are also paid by the Egyptian state, not the British. And because they're Europeans, they get paid at the European rate which is often higher than what the Egyptian rate is. So you've come into this country, you've sort of humiliated these bureaucrats by saying, your second in charge is going to be the one who's really making the decisions. They're not really making the decisions on behalf of Egyptians. And oh, by the way, we're going to pay your subordinates more money than you get. And by the way, you're going to be responsible for paying them, not us. All this is to say, again, that there are many, many reasons why British colonialism is incredibly frustrating or intolerable for many Egyptians. Right? And I haven't even gotten into the question of racism and chauvinism that courses through the British Empire. However, there is also a side to the colonial experience that sometimes gets left out, which we could describe as being more positive, or at least for natives is more attractive. The promise of being part of the British Empire isn't just about exploitation, but it's also about transforming the local societies into being more like Britain. And here I'm not talking about just sort of raw economics, but especially in terms of the idea of creating a liberal society, a society that believes in the rule of law, a society that believes basically in capitalism, but especially in the industrial spirit. A society that believes basically that the key to advancement should be merit, not social position. As the British are getting involved in Egypt in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, there are a number of Egyptians who look at them and say, even though we might not like the formal aspects of colonialism, there is an element of improvement for Egyptian society that we can borrow or that we can learn from the British. And so you have a number of politicians, you have a number of Egyptian notables that look upon the British kind of involvement and say, okay, as long as this is temporary, this could actually really benefit Egyptian society. Now, I've been talking so far about the idea of modernization, but there's another kind of idea related to the idea of modernization at the turn of the century that becomes very popular, and that is, of course, nationalism. This is the idea that the world is divided into separate and distinct national groups, and that these national groups should be the basis of all political organization. Before 1900, this idea is not very popular or well known in Egyptian society. Egyptians may have thought of themselves as Arabs. They obviously thought of themselves as part of the Muslim world. But there had also been this sort of long history of Egypt being ruled over by people who were essentially foreigners. You can go back to Cleopatra and Mark Antony and the idea of the Romans being involved in Egypt. You can talk about the Arab conquest in the 7th century. You could talk about the Mamelukes, the Ottomans. Even as we saw, Muhammad Ali is not native to Egypt. He's not Egyptian. He's an Albanian. So again, Egyptians tend to think about themselves more as Muslims. Obviously, you have Egyptian Jews there. You have Coptic Christians that are there. And they think about themselves primarily, politically, as being Ottoman subjects. So you have all these different loyalties that are out there, all these different identities, but the question of being Egyptian, politically speaking, before 1900 isn't very high among this list. Around 1900, however, this begins to change. You have, for example, newspapers, such as Mustafa Kemal's Aliwa, that began to focus on the idea that Egypt was its own distinct, separate political entity. And so one of the things that's going to happen as you start to get into the 20th century is that the more Egyptians start to feel that they are part of an Egyptian community and that politically speaking, they should all be united and distinct from all these other colonial powers that are out there, all these other forces that are dominating Egyptian politics and society, there begins to be a kind of natural tension that gets exposed between British colonialism and the desires of the native population. This tension develops and plays up over the first half of the 20th century, and it is essentially going to set the stage for Nasser's seizure of power in the 1950s. But we'll get into that a little bit more in just a moment. Before we get there, we do want to also point out what happens to some of these other intellectual movements in Egyptian society. Some of them, as we'll see, will come back and play a big role a little bit later in the story. One of the big developments that happens across the first half of the 20th century is the failure of Egyptian liberalism. And it's highlighted by the story of the Wafd Party. The story of the Wafd Party basically starts with the end of World War I. Of course, you remember at the tail end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson had announced his sort of points. He had talked about this idea of national self-determination. In many places around the world, including places like what is today Vietnam, but also Egypt, they hear this language of national self-determination. They think of it in a kind of anti-colonial way, and they expect that when the Paris Peace Conference happens, they will be given a chance to plead for their own rights. In the same way that, for example, the Czechs and the Poles and some of the South Slavic groups do. However, instead of kind of supporting this or embracing this, instead of kind of allowing the ideological promises of the late period of World War I to then become reality, the British cracked down massively on this Wafd movement and on these calls for reform. The leader of the Wafd Party, a guy named Saad Zaghloul, was arrested and sent to Malta. But these initial repressions trigger kind of massive uprising, and the British are facing this not only in Egypt, but also in places like Ireland. And so, not wanting to fight like 6 battles at the same time, the British basically say we are going to unilaterally award Egypt independence in 1922. However, the British are very cunning. The British want to remain a part of the Middle East. They obviously care a lot about this passage to India. And so when the British withdraw, they basically force the Egyptians to accept a number of British rights that will continue on after the ending of formal colonialism. Probably the most important of these sort of rights for our purposes was the idea that Britain had the right to defend Egypt against foreign invasion. And so, of course, when World War II happens, when the Nazis are trying to kind of take control of the Middle East, trying to kind of take control of Suez, it is easy for Britain to intervene because they've already got these agreements in place. We already have the right to defend you. And so the war that plays out in the desert is kind of understood as a war of Britain protecting Egypt. Nominally speaking, of course, as we talked about, Egypt is allied with Britain during World War II. They don't actually declare war on the Germans. So it's kind of weird thinking if you're a neutral country, but there's people fighting in your territory, but that's the kind of technical way that this happens. You do, of course, have, as we talked about, a number of Arabs as well as Jews who volunteer to fight for the British. But you also have a large number, a significant number of Egyptians who feel a sense of sympathy for Nazi Germany. And this sympathy is not for fascism, it's not for the racism of Nazi Germany, which looks down upon Arabs, but it is sort of directly related to the idea of anti-colonialism. If you want the British to leave, sometimes you need someone to come in and kick out whoever the occupying power is. And so again, there are a number of Egyptians that are sympathetic to Nazism. The Nazis, the fascists in Italy, of course, they're broadcasting in Arabic language radio stations about the idea of future independence. We talked about Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian leader who winds up in Germany during World War II, making broadcasts, trying to get the Egyptian people to rise up against the British. Importantly, one of these Egyptians who has a kind of sympathy towards Nazism is the king Farouk. Basically, we skipped over this, but when the formal period of being part of the Ottoman Empire ends after World War I, they basically take the wali, the governor position, and they turn it into being a king. At any rate, Farouk has these kind of Nazi sympathies. He writes letters to Hitler. And he talks about the idea of, well, what if Egypt declared war on Britain? What could you do for us? How would you support us? Another guy who has kind of pro-Nazi sympathies is the former Prime Minister, Ali Mahar. And so in early 1942, this is a period again when Erwin Rommel is approaching Alexandria, Farouk considers replacing the current Prime Minister with Mahar. And for the British, obviously, this would be a disaster, right? We're already fighting this very existential battle. Things are very kind of close, very kind of, we're not sure how the outcome is going to turn out. What if the Egyptian state turns on us? We're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so basically, to prevent the naming of Mahar as the new prime minister, the British ambassador, Miles Lampson, has the royal compound surrounded by British tanks. The British kind of make Farouk an offer he can't refuse, right? You're not going to appoint this guy we don't want. You're going to make the right decision, wink, wink. And so basically Farouk does this, and then after the Battle of Al Alamein, all of this kind of debate seems moot, right? The Egyptians are not suddenly going to declare for the Nazis once the Nazis are no longer there to help them. In the long run, however, this decision, this kind of naked aggression, if you will, this naked show of force, proves to be one of the most devastating events in the history of British-Egyptian relations. It exposes, in a very raw and fundamental way, the rift in the interests between the British and the Egyptians. Right? They're not actually that aligned with each other. They don't enjoy a friendly relationship. This isn't, if you think about, if you went to college, a place like Furman, of course, you had a great teacher, right? You had someone that was an adult, a mentor. They're trying to help you. Maybe sometimes you don't see things the same way, but the overall goal is one of respect, is one of trying to work together. Certainly you have each other's best interests at heart. This episode in 1942 reveals for Egyptians in a very kind of open and obvious way that the British don't really care about what's best for Egypt. The British care about what's best for Britain. And so after 1942, many Egyptians, including crucially a young colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser, came to the conclusion that any continued association with Britain was intolerable. And so after 1942, many Egyptians, including crucially a young officer named Gamal Abdel Nasser, came to the conclusion that any continued association with Britain was intolerable. From this point onward, Egyptian patriotism would be understood through the desire of expelling the British. Again, what does it mean to be an Egyptian patriot? It means by definition you are anti-British, anti-imperialist. And so the person who can do the most to get the British to leave, by definition becomes a national hero. The person who can most embody the spirit of anti-colonialism becomes the national hero or national savior even. And so this, of course, is exactly what is going to happen with Nasser. Now, in the immediate post-war period, it is not yet obvious to Egyptians who is the guy or guys that are going to do this work of anti-colonialism, who's going to be the best person or institution to work through to get to the idea of complete and total independence. For a lot of Egyptians, the first kind of choice here is going to be Farouk. You already have this institution of the monarchy. You already have a lot of political power wrapped up in that figure of the king. And so why wouldn't Farouk be the one to lead us forward? The problem, of course, is that in the spring of 1948, as we talked about, one of Farouk's big decisions is to go to war with Israel. Right? If you want to be, again, the embodiment of anti-colonialism, fighting against Israel is a great way to show everybody how anti-colonial you are. But Egyptian forces kind of rush into the first Arab-Israeli war. They aren't well supplied. They don't really have a good strategic plan. And there's a feeling that the monarchy has kind of bungled this situation. That it's not just that they lost, but that they weren't prepared, that they didn't give it their best, that there was this kind of fundamental failure of imagination. For many Egyptians after 1948, Farouk is no longer the vessel to achieve anti-colonialism. He's a big part of the problem in terms of why it hasn't happened yet. The status quo that existed in the 1940s and 30s and to some extent the 20s becomes part of the explanation as to why things are so bad today. And this isn't just the question of the monarch and Farouk, but it also gets applied to the liberal Wafd party, who had been the most popular party in Egypt in the 1920s. In the years after 1948, Egyptian patriots would begin searching for alternatives to liberalism, alternatives politically, socially, culturally, to the Egypt of the 1920s, right? The liberal experiment has failed. What else can we do? Some, of course, as I mentioned, will turn to religion. This isn't the place to get into it, but basically in 1928, there is a young school teacher named Hassan al-Banna, and he will found this organization known as the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, technically speaking, the Muslim Brotherhood is not a political organization. It is supposed to be religious. It's about the idea of kind of abandoning politics and focusing on sort of a more complete submission or enriching experience of Islam, thinking about some of the social dimensions of it. There are a number of other sort of options out there. We have an Egyptian Communist Party. We have in 1933 the foundation of Young Egypt, which was a fascist party. They become official in 1936, so sometimes you see kind of different dates there. But the point is that you have all these different alternatives, all these different ways that people are looking to achieve an independent Egypt. Of course, the guy who's going to pull this off is Nasser, and his central kind of message is going to turn into nationalism, or Arab nationalism specifically. Now, Nasser is, historically speaking, a really fascinating guy. Nasser is someone that, at a certain sort of abstract level, gets associated with the idea of Arab nationalism. Again, it's kind of his calling card. It's the thing he's best known for. It's his entrance music, if you like wrestling analogies. But if you actually drill down on the history of it, Nasser does not start out as an Arab nationalist. And he has these kind of contradictory aspects of his personality or his ideology that are kind of fascinating to think about. As I said, again, the word most associated with him is Arab nationalism. But if you look at what he actually did, he is, in the parlance of our times, really an Egypt first guy. His policies are supposed to be good first and foremost for Egypt. The amount of sacrifice that he's willing to do for his fellow brother Arabs and sisters, it gets into a kind of gray, mushy area where it's like, well, sometimes he's clearly doing things for Egypt first. A lot of the things he does for Egypt are actually very positive. He transformed Egypt into the most important, most powerful country, one could argue, in the Middle East in the 1950s. He wins global acclaim for not just being anti-imperialist, but also he becomes very active in the non-aligned movement. For all the stuff we're going to talk today about anti-imperialism, anti-Britishness, Nasser is not completely cut off from the West, especially not before 1956. Nasser is actually very successful in terms of economic development. To live in Egypt in the 1950s is to live in one of the best sort of areas or environments in the Middle East, the most prosperous, the most affluent. People describe Cairo as Paris on the Nile in the 1950s. By the time you get to the late 1960s, it's a totally different story. The Egyptian economy is stagnated. Politically, it's stagnated. It doesn't feel like the dynamic sort of force that it was in the 50s. Nasser is also today very much associated with the idea of secularism. Right? If we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about politics, this idea of what role should Islam have in the political destinies of the region. There are a variety of different options people have to choose from, and some lean very heavily into the notion of religion. Some would say we shouldn't really be focused on religion at all. If people want to be Muslim or Jewish or Christian, whatever, we don't care about that, but the government should be totally secular. And so they hold up Nasser as being a kind of champion of secularism. What's interesting about this is that Nasser, very early on in his lifetime, was actually a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, he probably did that less because he cared about religious convictions. Then again, he cared about this idea of anti-colonialism, of Egyptian independence, and the Muslim Brotherhood seemed like the best path forward. I mentioned a moment ago so many of these early successes that Nasser has, especially, of course, he becomes a rock star. He becomes this kind of world historical figure. But if you look at his political legacy, Arab nationalism is almost completely abandoned by his successors, especially Anwar Sadat. In terms of his political and diplomatic triumphs, Egypt doesn't really experience that many successes. As we'll talk about in a little bit, Egypt at one point will unify with Syria in 1958. They will form the United Arab Republic. This looks like the future path of politics in the Middle East. Aren't we all going to band together in Arab unity? And by 1961, the whole thing is over. The Syrians have revolted. They don't like it at all. Nasser becomes very involved in Yemen in the 1960s. That doesn't work out very well for them. Nasser fights a couple wars with Israel, loses both of them. And so in some ways, basically, one could argue that Nasser is a lot like Napoleon III, where the idea of Nasser, the idea of Napoleon III, is always a little bit more powerful than the individual actually was. Right? The legend of Nasser is much bigger and much more powerful than his actual impact and legacy wound up being. Okay, let me get into some details about Nasser himself as opposed to these kind of broader abstract comments. Gamal Abdel Nasser was born to a middle-class family in the port of Alexandria in January of 1918. Nasser had somewhat of a turbulent childhood. He actually moves around 8 different times in Egypt. His mom dies when he's 8. He kind of overcomes this background. He's a decent student. And in the mid-1930s, he starts to become politically active. He will, for example, organize a student demonstration against the British in 1935. Now again, Nasser is growing up at this moment when the idea that the Wafd party, the idea that liberalism is going to save Egypt, people are starting to become sort of disenchanted with that. And so Nasser will actually briefly join Young Egypt, which is the fascist organization, in 1936. Nasser decides to pursue a career in the army. He basically gets turned down the first time he applies, realizes that he kind of needs a patron. So he gets a patron to kind of get him entrance into the military academy. And then Nasser, of course, becomes an officer in the Egyptian military. During World War II, while all this fighting is going on, he actually becomes an instructor at the academy. He gets married and he starts having a family. And just as an aside, we talked a lot about dictators over the course of these episodes and podcasts, right? We talked about people like Mussolini, who's out there kind of sleeping around as much as he can. Obviously, there's a lot of that sometimes with kings and rulers. Nasser is a family guy. You know, whatever's going on globally, whatever's going on politically, in terms of his private life, Nasser was very much dedicated to the idea of his family. He, of course, was also dedicated to the idea of, again, kicking out the British. And so in 1943 or early 1944, Nasser actually joins the Muslim Brotherhood, which at this point is not only involved in sort of the social work, but also has created a sort of secret section within the military aimed at this idea of revolution, aimed at the idea of using violence to solve social problems. Now, again, how much Nasser was dedicated to this idea, what his perceptions of the relationship between politics and Islam were, these are debated and complicated. What's clear is that he was interested in the idea of anti-colonialism. And so the Muslim Brotherhood at that point seemed like a good way to move in that direction. Finally, one last episode was pretty important in terms of the formation of who Nasser became, and that was the 1948 First Arab-Israeli War in Palestine. Basically, Nasser is one of those troops that is sent up to fight the Israelis. And he experiences not just the sort of bitterness of defeat, but again, this sort of feeling like we're here fighting for this ideal, but the people in power, the people in charge, they don't really care about us. They didn't really think, what would be the best position for us to be in? How could we actually win this war? They treat us like pawns on a chessboard, and if you lose a pawn playing chess, who cares? So again, the First Arab-Israeli War for Nasser highlights the inadequacies of the regime back home. In 1955, once he's come to power, Nasser writes this reflection called The Philosophy of the Revolution, and in it he talks about his experiences in Palestine. He says, quote, "We were fighting in Palestine, but our dreams were all in Egypt." So like many Egyptian nationalists, again, defeat in Palestine hardens his resolve against the monarchy, and he starts looking for like-minded individuals to go after and overthrow Egypt's monarchy. Once the armistice with Israel had been reached in the summer of 1949, Nasser and about 300 patriotic Egyptian officers would found the Free Officer Movement. Now, the Free Officer Movement is a group of lower kind of middle-class army men. Again, they were convinced that colonization is not only a product of British strength, but it's also a consequence of Egyptian weakness. And so how do we overcome that weakness? How do we modernize Egyptian society to kind of expel these British invaders? This is what the Free Officer Movement becomes all about. Now, they never really become a mass organization. They do a lot kind of behind the scenes. They spend a lot of time, as many revolutionary parties do, kind of drawing up their six-point program. They obviously want to end the monarchy. They want to create a democratic society. They want the end of aristocratic economic privileges. They want to invest in the country and develop strong institutions and a strong middle class. And of course, most importantly, they want full and complete independence from Britain. For most of its 2 years of existence, this Free Officer Movement, again, there is a lot of talking, there is not a lot of action. The key event that pushes them to revolution is this perception in the summer of 1952 that King Farouk is about to go after their organization. I don't want to go into this because there's a lot of very minor, complicated history here. There's the board of this officers club, and they elect a lot of these free officers to it, and then the king decides to kind of purge it, so he kicks them all out. But basically, in the summer of 1952, the free officers are like, oh, they're coming for us. This is a moment where we have to take action or we will no longer exist. And so they reach out to a couple of like-minded military officers, including, most importantly, the senior general Mohammed Naguib. And on July 23rd, 1952, Naguib's units will begin to seize key positions in the city of Cairo. A couple days later, they capture Farouk, they depose him, and they exile him to the French Riviera, which, if you're ever going to get exiled, I suppose that's probably a pretty decent place to wind up. Now, once they were in power, these free officers began to establish a dictatorship. They annul the liberal 1923 Egyptian constitution. They ban all political parties. Now, they don't ban the Muslim Brotherhood at this point because the Muslim Brotherhood was technically a religious organization. but that will happen a little while later once they kind of have a falling out with them. Naguib and Nasser would also have a falling out, and Nasser replaced the older general officially in 1954. By 1956, Nasser had established complete control over Egyptian society, affirming his leading role by winning a presidential plebiscite that same year with 99% of the vote. All this said, Nasser in the summer of 1956 was not yet the Nasser of legend. He was not yet the lion of the Middle East. This would only come in 1956 via his showdown with Britain, France, and of course, Israel. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we get there, of course, we have to talk about Israel and Palestine. We're about an hour into this podcast, and we're talking about Israeli and Palestinian history, and I've been going on about Egypt. Let's talk about Israel, and then we'll talk about the Palestinians. If in many ways the Egyptian kind of political mindset was defined by its relationship to Britain and the idea of anti-colonialism, the Israelis still confronted the unfinished nature of the First Arab-Israeli War. In essence, there are basically two major problems here that have not yet been resolved. And the first of these, of course, was the lack of a formal peace treaty ending the war. Israel had signed armistice agreements with most of its kind of rivals, most of its former combatants. Technically, it was still at war with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. But all of those countries still refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. All of them taught the idea in their schools that Israel was fundamentally unjust and didn't deserve to be there. In terms of rhetoric, Arab politicians from across the region continued to talk about the idea that one day the Arab armies would return and destroy the Jewish state. Sometimes they speak more explicitly about what's supposed to happen to the Jews living there, sometimes less, right? We'll figure it out once we take it over. You also have, on almost every front, almost continuous violations of the ceasefire. Right? Even though we have a ceasefire, even though it's okay, we're not going to shoot at each other, there are still random people taking shots at each other, border incursions, people firing on each other. So even though the war technically ended in 1949, in many ways it was still going on a day-to-day basis on the various sort of border hotspots. And so from the Israeli perspective, this question again of their own existence is still existential. The war isn't over, it's just taken a kind of slight pause, so we need to be ready to continue to fight it if and when the time comes. Now, one of the things that happens, of course, when you lose a war, as the Egyptians did, is you say, okay, how can we win the next time? How can we make our army better and stronger? How can we make it more effective? And so one of the things that's going to happen is that Nasser is going to look for more weapons, and he's going to stop buying them from the UK, because there's obviously tensions with the UK. And the place, of course, that he's going to be able to get weapons in the 1950s and 60s is the Soviet Union. And not just kind of like Kalashnikovs, not just, kind of older weapons, older rifles, but we're talking about modern stuff. We're talking about MiG fighter jets. We're talking initially about T-34 tanks, but later on, more modern tanks. And so as Arab regimes begin to find these alternative source of arms in the 1950s, it convinces Israel's political leaders that you are still in danger. These guys who have talked about driving you into the sea and wiping you off the map, that are still sort of technically at war with you, and now they're getting better, more effective military technology, it's not a signal that the war is over and that peace is about to happen. Quite the opposite, it's going to make you really, really nervous. And so in many ways, the trigger event that causes 1956, one could argue, is Nasser's deal with the Soviets via the Czechoslovaks in 1955. That once Nasser finds a supply of modern weaponry, for the Israelis, the clock is ticking, and it's just a question of when is he going to use it. And so when do you decide to time your kind of attack, your kind of preemptive move to prevent him from using them. The second major issue, of course, relates to the Palestinians. As we've discussed, in the aftermath of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, you had hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinian refugees who continued to be stateless, who didn't have a home or a country, didn't have a future to look forward to. And many of these Palestinian refugees happened to live on the borders of Gaza and the West Bank. And so some of these refugees, in the aftermath of the first Arab-Israeli War, they will continue to try to negotiate in some ways the existence of this border. Now, when I say negotiate, I don't mean sit down at a table and talk to Israeli leaders and flush things out. I mean that they negotiate it through practice. Right? There's a border there, but do I recognize it? Especially in the immediate aftermath of the war, some people want to go home. Some people want to temporarily go back. It's harvest time. Let's get the apples off the trees or the oranges off the trees. Let me go back and recover the possessions that I couldn't take. Let me go back and express my frustration with some of those Israeli settlers that have moved in, refugees maybe even from other parts of the Middle East. These borders, even though they exist on a map, even though they exist in a diplomatic, legal sense, don't necessarily exist in people's minds. They aren't recognized by many of these Palestinian refugees, and so you get frequent transgressions over those borders, frequent incursions. Just to give you a sense of how common this was, in 1952, there were over 16,000 incursions into Israeli territory alone. Now, again, many of these incursions are relatively either innocuous or we might say they're understandable. I've been driven off my land. I'm only 30 miles, 30 kilometers even from my land, might even be closer. Of course I'm going to go back. Of course I have memories there. Some of the people living in the Middle East are Bedouins. They're nomadic. It's not that they don't understand the concept of a border, but the idea that that's meaningful to them has never really mattered, right? You're way out there in the desert. Who cares where your sheep are eating from, right? Does it matter if you're, in one territory or another? No, you live, you survive, you're nomadic. However, a small portion of these incursions are not just sort of, again, innocuous or understandable, but they are seen as strategic. They are carried out by a group of Palestinian militiamen known as Fedayeen. And these Fedayeen will carry out acts of sabotage. They will carry out acts of killing, acts of violence. In many ways, they are there not because they just kind of want to go back home again, but they are there to continue the war that they lost in 1948. When you read the sources, generally speaking, Israeli sources will talk about these people as terrorists. Terrorists are people who are using violence to try to get something that they want illegitimately. Arab sources tend to describe them as freedom fighters or martyrs. Of course, a freedom fighter, a martyr, is using that violence, but it is legitimate. Whatever you want to call these Fedayeen guys, the basic point here is that over the course of time, they became increasingly sophisticated, increasingly organized. I used the term militias a little bit earlier, right? So this is not an official state-sponsored military body like an army unit, but they do begin to get arms and weapons and training from the Egyptians in particular. Later on, also the Syrians. The Egyptians will begin to support and grow these Fedayeen units, especially in 1952 and 1953. In December of 1952, for example, the Egyptian army creates a Palestinian border police. It's headed by a former Egyptian soldier named Abdul Manimi Abdul Rauf. Rauf also happens to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And despite their kind of focus on religious issues before 1948, the Muslim Brotherhood had actually been one of the largest organizers of sending troops to Palestine to fight in the 1948 Civil War. In March of 1953, the Fedayeen began formal military training, especially again led by the Egyptians. And over the course of the next 3 years, the Fedayeen would carry out a number of attacks within Israel, leading to several hundred Israeli deaths and over 1,000 wounded Israeli civilians. If you wanted to talk about their sort of strategy, again, the key point here is violence. The key point is keeping the conflict alive. It is much more like October 7th in the sense that the idea of October 7th was to create as much sort of mass death and suffering as possible. There was never really any attempt by Hamas on October 7th to secure territory. Hamas never thought, okay, we're going to attack on October 7th, and then we're going to move up the coast, and we'll take Tel Aviv, and we'll defeat these IDF units. It was a raid, right? It was designed to create violence, suffering, and to prolong the conflict. And this is, of course, what also happened in the 1950s. Now, to combat the Fedayeen issue, the Israeli government pursued, in many ways, a very similar policy to what we're seeing today in Gaza, which is the idea of disproportionate response. How do you convince someone to leave you alone? Well, if they're bothering you, if you use disproportionate responses, they come over, they kind of push you a little bit. Well, you punch them in the face, they'll learn really quickly to stop messing with you. And this is the mindset, really, that Israelis have had going back all the way to the foundation of the State of Israel. If you attack us, we are going to respond with a disproportionate amount of force to make you learn your lesson. We're not only going to direct that force against the people who are responsible for whatever took place, but we are also going to direct that against the sort of bystanders. We're going to direct that violence against the people that may have been able to prevent it but chose not to. And so if a Fedayeen attack comes from a refugee camp, we are going to blame all the people in the refugee camp and make them all suffer. In that way, they will learn, the better thing to do is to not allow these guys to attack in the first place. Before 1956, there are a number of examples where Israel attacks not only Palestinians and Palestinian refugee camps, but also Jordanian, Egyptian, and Syrian troops. You Egyptians that are in Gaza, if you allow these Fedayeen attacks to continue, you are going to pay the price for them. In August of 1953, for example, David Ben-Gurion directly charged this 25-year-old paratroop commander named Ariel Sharon to supervise the creation of a new, specifically dedicated to reprisals, a new group known as Unit 101. Unit 101 was supposed to be this kind of black ops, Green Beret style like group. They're supposed to be able to cross into enemy territory, go over the lines, infiltrate a refugee camp, and carry out things like assassinations. Just to give you a sense of the mentality of Group 101, just to give you a sense of the mentality of Unit 101, one of the things they do to train is they'll just go over the border into the West Bank and they'll see how many weeks can we just hang out in Jordanian territory amongst all these Palestinians. Another specific example, in one of their sort of first raids, Unit 101 will enter the Brej refugee camp in Gaza. Their mission was to assassinate Major Mustafa Hafez. Hafez was the head of Egyptian military intelligence in Gaza. Hafez happens to not be home. But in the course of looking for him, Unit 101 killed 20 Palestinian refugees, including 7 women and 5 children. The most notorious action undertaken by Unit 101 occurs in October of 1953, when Israeli soldiers respond to the killing of an Israeli mother and her 2 children by attacking the Jordanian village of Kibbia. On the night of October 14th, Sharon led several hundred Israeli soldiers across the border with orders to, quote, carry out destruction and maximize killing in order to drive the villagers from their homes, end quote. This is not a summary of a historian talking about that I just read to you. This is the actual orders. Right? The idea of maximum killing, maximum suffering by civilians in order to send a message. In his memoir, Sharon actually added that he was ordered to blow up every single building in the village. And the message was to be clear in terms of the consequence, again, of attacking Jews. That night, Sharon's men attacked from 3 sides. They killed about a dozen guards in the village. And then they did actually level every single building. They put dynamite in them, whether or not they were occupied. In the end, 69 Arabs will die in Kibya, the vast majority of which were women and children. This particular reprisal action was so heinous that it provoked global outcry. 2 weeks later, it was officially condemned by the United Nations. Unfortunately, however, neither the Fedayeen attacks nor the Israeli responses did much to quell the violence. Quite the opposite, they actually increased the frequency and intensity of these types of attacks. Another major event occurs on February 28, 1955, when the Israeli army launched another reprisal attack into Gaza. This time they would kill 38 Egyptian soldiers and 2 local Arabs. Now, I can go on and on again with many of these examples, but I think you get the picture. The lack of a resolution to the refugee issue, the increasingly poor economic conditions in Gaza, these basically encouraged a new generation of Palestinians to take matters into their own hands through the notion of violent resistance. We'll talk about this more in a different episode, but it is not accidental that if you look at the major Palestinian political figures from the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, people like Yasser Arafat, people like Abu Jihad, people like Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas, these people all come directly from the Gazan context, where they all spend significant amounts of time in Gaza. The lack of resolution and the continuing violence lead Palestinians, at least a significant minority, to embrace the idea that only through violence can we achieve change, and so there is an effort made again to continue the war even after the armistice agreements. When you put these two things together, by October of 1955, the Israeli government has become convinced that war is only a matter of time. It is inevitable, and so the best thing to do is to strike first before the Egyptians can attack, before they can wipe out your air force, before they can coordinate everything. If you want to fight a battle, you want to fight it on your terms and on your terrain or your choosing of the terrain, as opposed to letting the enemy take the initiative. And so basically the Israelis resolved to attack Egypt. The question was just when would that happen? In the run-up to the actual war in 1956, the Egyptians take a number of additional sort of hostile acts that convince the Israelis even more that this is going to happen. They close, for example, the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. So basically the southern port of Eilat, Israeli ships aren't able to go in there. They will close Egyptian airspace to the Israeli airline Al Al. And so again, for Israelis, late 1955, early 1956, there's a clock ticking, and you basically feel like you have to attack or you're about to be attacked. We have just 2 more players to discuss before we get to the actual outbreak of the war, and that is, of course, the British and the French, both of which were dealing in the early 1950s with what one might call the post-colonial moment. In essence, both Britain and France, after World War II, want to kind of put the pieces of empire back together. Both of them have been significantly weakened by the fighting, right, in World War II. Both of them need money, need in some ways weapons and arms. And so they're kind of confronting this moment after World War II when there's this desire to turn the clock back to what it had been, but where the circumstances are much different. one of the reasons that the Allies win World War II is that they get support from the colonial territories. People living in North Africa, people living in places like India, right? Support and sacrifice on behalf of the Allied cause. After the war is over, the question becomes, if France needed us to survive, if Britain needed us to survive, why should we be dependent on them if in a material sense they're kind of dependent on us? And so part of the new reality after 1945 is that colonial peoples are no longer willing to tolerate the idea of colonialism. This especially becomes the case by the time of the mid-1950s. The other big change, of course, is that in terms of power, Britain and France have both been eclipsed by the United States and the Soviet Union. And so in some ways, it doesn't matter what the British want to do anymore or what the French want to do anymore. They can't do it if the United States or the Soviet Union doesn't support whatever they're doing. Neither the British nor the French, one could argue, had really come yet to understand this new reality in 1956 or before 1956. But Suez is the moment when they will learn this lesson. Now, in terms of trying to flush out just a little bit more clearly the British perspective on what's going on, the British don't actively try to take formal colonial control over their former colonies, some of which had only been sort of indirect colonies. But what they try to do is to renew their alliances with the various Arab states, such as Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. Now, obviously, in retrospect, they looked back on this idea of supporting Zionism in the 1920s. They kind of regretted it. They kind of realized, whoops, we screwed that up, pissed off a lot of Arabs. And so after World War II, and even a little bit before it, much of British policy is designed to try to placate Arab sentiment, to try to win back the kind of spirit of collective action. The British also try to do this by maintaining good relations with Egypt politically. They will revisit in mid-1936 that moment of one-sided unilateral independence for Egypt. And they will negotiate a new treaty called the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. The British also tried to maintain or enhance good relations with Egypt by revisiting that initial Declaration of Independence from 1922. They go back and they say, well, maybe we can water down a little bit our physical presence here in the Egyptian state, and this leads to the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty. This treaty means that basically all British forces have to withdraw from Egypt, with the exception of the Canal Zone, and we're going to put a cap on those British forces at 10,000 men. Britain is also, again, here to support and defend the idea of Egyptian sovereignty, and so Britain is going to give the Egyptians military hardware. Britain promises that in the event of war, it will support Egypt. It will defend Egypt. Now, we've talked about some of this already, but it's important to note that in the aftermath of Nasser's seizure of power in 1954, the British didn't simply abandon the idea of working with him. For all his kind of anti-colonial spirit, Nasser had not yet given up on the hope that some kind of arrangement or accommodation could be reached with the British. In 1954, the two sides signed a new treaty that basically calls for all British troops to leave the country by the summer of 1956. Now, it does include a provision that if British or Egyptian interests are threatened, those troops can come back, they can protect the canal. But if you think about it, who is Egypt's number one enemy in the late 1940s, early 1950s? It's Israel, right? What is the nature of the relationship between the British and the Israelis? Well, it's a very cold one. The British have just been kind of kicked out of Palestine in 1948 after fighting a 2-year-long Jewish insurgency. The British don't like the Israelis very much. The idea that the British might come in and help Jordan, who is their ally, might help Egypt, who is still sort of potentially an ally, That doesn't seem far-fetched. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Of course, in the end, this relationship proves to be unworkable. But there are moments when you think, well, what if it could have gone slightly differently? What if some other dominoes that fell had not fallen? It's not a question that we can really answer, but it's worth kind of recognizing that that moment was there. Now, the French position in the story is a bit less straightforward. As we saw, the French did hold the majority stake in the Suez Canal, and this economic consideration would be a major factor in the French decision to participate in the war. But the big issue that drew the French to Egypt in the summer of 1956 was not Egypt itself, but Algeria. Basically, in November 1954, a group called the Front de Libération Nationale, or the FLN, launched a bitter insurgency against the French colonial government. And by the time of 1956, this had kind of sputtered out into a broad-based rebellion. It was, again, very bloody, very, very personal, lots of killing of civilians, lots of violations of human rights, as we would think about today, by both sides, right? The idea of killing women and children is seen as something that's a good thing in this war. And so one of the things that helps the FLN greatly is support that they get from other groups in the Arab world. Sometimes we're talking about support that is logistical. If I can set up my base in the Sahara Desert, in Moroccan territory, in Tunisian territory, the French aren't really technically supposed to be able to go there. We're also talking about material support. One of the things that the Egyptians do is they will take some of their extra guns and weapons and things like that, and they will ship them clandestinely to the Algerian rebels. Radio Cairo will broadcast FLN propaganda. We'll play them up. We'll talk about them as heroes and freedom fighters. And so basically, as the French are thinking about the geopolitical situation of North Africa, they're struggling to figure out how do we stop this insurgency. Taking out the Egyptian base of supply for the FLN seems to be a really, really good move. Seems to be something that could concretely achieve progress in this quagmire of Algeria. To put all these various pieces together, what essentially is going to happen is that in 1955-56, Nasser will increasingly move away from the British and British interests and will grow closer and closer to the Soviet Union and to the kind of second world, the communist world, if you will. As this happens, the British and the French decide that taking down Nasser is going to be the most important step or the most practical goal, if you will, towards protecting their colonial or post-colonial influence in the region. For the Israelis, carrying out a sort of first strike operation against Nasser would hopefully alleviate the danger of an Egyptian invasion and would possibly save the state of Israel. Finally, for Nasser himself, as he's navigating all of these kind of contours, these difficult relationships, the idea of a showdown with the West is in many ways exactly what he wants. To stand up against the former imperial powers, to stand up against the Israeli Zionist state, this is an opportunity to defend the necessity of his dictatorship that has really just been established. Right? Why should we get rid of democracy? Why should we have this strongman? Why should we not have civil rights? Well, if Nasser is a world historical figure of destiny, if Nasser is the guy protecting you from those evil imperial powers, from those Zionists, the more he looks like that guy, the more popular he will be. And so essentially one could argue that the die were cast for a major war. It is just a question of when and where it's going to begin, and we'll cover this subject in our next episode when we talk about the actual fighting in the war itself. For now, I'd like to thank you for joining us. As always, if you liked our show, we hope you'll tell your friends about it. You can also, of course, Post about it on social media. You can give us a rating on Spotify or on Apple, on iTunes. But we really appreciate those of you who have taken that action so far and tried to promote us. If you enjoyed the episode and you want to find out more about what we have on offer, about other episodes, as I mentioned at the beginning, you can find that on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. Once again, that's www.historyoffthepage.com. That's going to be it for now. We hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.